And I'm going to bring Jonathan to the stage, as well as invite the panelists to come up and introduce the next panel on quantitative disclosures. Thank you.
Thanks, Wes. So thanks. This is going to be a great panel. I'm really looking forward to it. Let's bring Catherine Atkin up first. She is the director and co-founder of Carbon Accountable, and also one of the principal drafters of California's suite of new carbon accounting rules. So this panel will go beyond carbon, but it will include carbon. Next, we have David Greenell, who is the KPMG. Let's see, I apologize, David, I have to read your title. Global Managing Director of Climate Risk, Decarbonization, and Nature at KPMG. It's a fantastic title, good portfolio. And then finally, but definitely not least, we have Sam King, SVP of Corporate at Just Impact. So it's actually difficult to follow the last panel. These topics overlap quite a bit, and our former moderator, Alec, did a fantastic job. But if you'll forgive those overlaps, what I'd love to do is think about ESG and with an emphasis on E, reporting and disclosure from I should say I'm a lawyer by training, and that bias will follow me here to this panel. I would like to have the sort of regulatory landscape laid out as best as it can be. And so I'd like to start with Catherine and ask, from the perspective of a drafter of climate-related disclosure rules and regulations in California, what was on your mind when you were drafting? What is the requirements? What are the requirements that California corporations or other entities subject to California's rules will be required to comply with? And when you were thinking about those requirements, what level of granularity or concreteness, or what degree the data was quantitative? Did you want those regulated entities to be able to respond to?
Okay. Well, thanks so much to Hedera and the HBAR Foundation for the opportunity to speak today. It's terrific to be part of this community, and I was just thinking when the last panelists were up here speaking that I've been to a couple of these events, and I just see kind of the evolution of the dialogue, and it's really exciting to see us all coming together to figure out where we are and where we need to go. And obviously the enabling environment is near and dear to my heart, and I think is a important driver of the kind of higher quality, robust, and accessible data that we do need to build carbon markets, the climate economy, and inform climate action. So when you talk about kind of what was the impetus for the work around California disclosures in California, it was really that, voluntary reporting was a really important kind of evolutionary stage that we were in as we learned how to do these things, but that it was never going to give us the kind of access to data that we need to drive the big changes that we need to make. So, and also just to recognize that this is a global movement that is happening, and that certainly in Europe we're seeing amazing leadership. I love the California disclosure laws. I kind of see them as the undergrad of disclosure, and then sort of the graduate level, the PhD people are in Europe right now, but we have a really important role to play in the United States, obviously given the importance to global capital of U.S. corporations. So the couple of the hallmarks that were really important to us in developing the policy was, number one, don't create the California flavor of ice cream, right? The whole point of this is that we want to allow corporations to disclose and for them to have an understanding that what they're doing in one place will be the same thing that they're asked to do in another place. So we did adopt the GHG protocol as the required standard for reporting in California when it comes to GHG emissions, and that obviously is the throughput to what we're seeing globally. We'll have a chance to talk about the protocol and the existing standards and kind of where they get us and maybe where else we need to go. So I think that's an important conversation, but we felt for the purposes of reporting that the GHG protocol was important. Full scope reporting, super important, right? Has to include scope 3. That's 90+% of the GHG emissions of corporations. And we know if carbon is an iceberg, sort of the little triangle at the top is scopes 1 and 2. And that huge mass of carbon is really in the supply chain. And so that was really important to us as well. Another element was public and private companies. So oftentimes we're very focused, of course, because we're looking at publicly traded companies for a lot of these regulated regimes, but we know that private companies have lots of carbon too, and in fact, it's really important that we get them in this game. So those were a couple of the sort of key elements. I would say, apropos to this conversation, it was also to impose an assurance standard, critical because we're not going to get good data without a watchful eye of a third party. So ensuring that we maybe begin with limited assurance, but we move to reasonable is going to be very important. So those were some of the hallmarks. I'm happy to talk about CSRD and the ESRS, or maybe somebody else can do that. But that's what we were thinking about in California, and we feel like we're totally aligned with CSRD. The ESRS standard includes the GHG protocol, and then the ISSB, which has created the IFRS standard, which is another really important contribution, which is other countries adopting the same standard, and we're all aligned. So it's not a completely overlapping Venn, but we're getting close. And I think digital interoperability will help us with that.
So before we get to CSRD, and we definitely will, I'm curious about the reaction to the new rules by the regulated community in California. Did they feel that they could comply with the tools available to them, or were there tools that they felt that they needed that they didn't have? What was the reaction to the anticipated burden?
Well, it was a journey. I mean, it didn't happen in 1 year. It happened in 3 years. So a lot has changed in a short period of time, but when we started with that legislative effort, there was a lot of hue and cry, but really, frankly, the focus was on the SEC rule. So in some ways, we benefited from a little bit of a what are those crazies doing out in California, right? We're gonna, the real thing is at the federal level. And I do wanna say, I'm an attorney and I'm a big believer in the role of the federal government, and we always saw this as a both and. So to the extent the SEC rule is I would love to say that it's gonna see the light of day, but given what just happened recently, probably not. But for corporations, certainly there was angst, but I think that, frankly, the fact that a lot are reporting under CSRD in Europe really helped as well, because they were some of the leading companies were already going to have to do this. I would say one other thing that has happened is that the role of technology and software solutions, it may be a little bit crowded right now, and I think the last panel talked about companies trying things but not feeling like they've got exactly, like the shoe doesn't fit quite right yet. But I think the recognition that what seems like reporting seems like a big burden, I think in the next 2 or 3 years I'm already seeing companies more comfortable with this sort of evolution, and they're on the road. So I think but certainly the business lobby was vociferously opposed to California's disclosure requirement, and it was really only because we have great political leadership that we were able to keep that policy robust and for all scopes. So I think corporations are moving along. Certainly there's the bell curve. There's the cool kids that are already doing it, that big middle that is sort of like trying it but not, probably doesn't really have their act together yet, and then those that are just, laggards. And I think that's just the way it's going to be.
Well, while the fate of the SEC rule may be in question now, it's, as you say, certainly possible that as regulated entities become more comfortable with the burdens imposed on them by much of the rest of the world, the sell will be easier at some point in the future. But part of that process of becoming more comfortable is that companies begin to see how they might comply at low cost with the full range of digital solutions that the folks in this room here today can provide to them. And so, David, I'd love if you could speak a bit to what your clients are facing and the kinds of tools that you provide to them or advice or services so that they can respond to the disclosure requirements that they face all over the world. And I know it's far beyond California, so maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. And I'll echo Catherine's comments at the beginning and thank HBAR and Hedera for the opportunity to speak today and to bring everyone together. Maybe to kind of set the stage and step back before I address some of the use cases around disclosure and other. I think what we're broadly, I think the landscape, what we're seeing around what I'll call these kind of next-gen digital innovations in terms of technologies, and think about things like blockchain, DLT, smart contracts, AI, Earth observation, satellite-based observations, all of these technologies kind of converging to be able to create new assets, new solutions, new methods, and new models in the finance, trade, risk management, compliance, kind of broader value exchange. So even before we start talking about climate and broader sustainability, think about what's taking place around things like digital central currencies, right? Tokenized green bonds, the evolution around digital in the context of payments and reconciliation in broader supply chain, just in terms of inventory management and all that. So that's all taking place, right, broadly. Then you overlay that with what we're seeing emerging in the climate and broader sustainability space, where I think that what you're seeing is the emergence of what I characterize as kind of new data platforms, new data markets, new data services that are really creating the means and the opportunity to integrate climate, integrate natural capital, integrate social capital into those finance, trade, compliance, risk management, and broader value exchange mechanisms. So that's taking place on top of it. And then I think what's also coming into play are these market and regulatory developments around the world, right, which are really driving the need for, and we heard about on the previous panel, the notion of trust and trustworthiness, right? And to me, that's right at the core of what we're talking about, right? And so needing to have that, both the trust and the confidence in the data, and to be able to substantiate those claims that are made against that data, and the performance and the impacts that are associated with a product, a project, an organization, or an enterprise. It could be at any one scale. So we talked about CSRD, obviously, from a disclosure standpoint, but this cuts across things like, and what we're seeing a lot of interest and action by many of our clients around EUDR, around the deforestation free regime, CBAM from a trade compliance standpoint. You see this in the responsible minerals and metals from a supply chain standpoint. We're also seeing it in EU, the circularity requirements at a product level around environmental life cycle impacts of products and how that relates to digital identity and digital product passports. So those things are kind of coming together. We're also seeing some kind of what I'll call as emerging use cases, such as in the United States under the IRA, under the tax credit regime. One of them is 45V, which relates to the green hydraulic hydrogen production and the need to be able, from an energy attribute certificate standpoint, being able to marry up the renewable electricity generation and moving from what's today currently kind of cuts across the board. Everyone's treated the same in terms of just using a standard algorithm or emissions coefficient, effectively, right, to moving on a monthly basis to moving to real-time hourly matching that's differentiated, right? So you're seeing that. And then we also talked about, the previous panel also talked about this notion of different ways of approaching GHG emissions accounting and management, right? And things like the GHG protocol, but also thinking about it from the standpoint of financial management and financial reporting, you know, emergence of things like e-liabilities, right? And, you know, the IFRS, IAS standards around things like IAS 37 around contingent liabilities, and how does this line up, and the ability of these technologies, right? So all those things are kind of converging. I think what it really reinforces, to go back to the trust notion, and I think this has been already said, but really what we're talking about is we need to, in order to develop that digitally enabled trust infrastructure, right, upon which all of this is either going to succeed or fail, is very much on having trust in the data, trust in the models and their analytics and their calculations, and trust in the interpretive methods that we apply against around all of that.
Fantastic, and I almost want you to keep on going because it's so educational. From your perspective, and again, probably just because I'm a lawyer and I think a lot about these kinds of dynamics, do you think that the regulators and legislators of the world have any sense of the power of these tools? It's certainly from the perspective of having written EPA rules in government, you know, we would have been completely oblivious at the time to the you know, emerging tools that, you know, could have made our rules, if anything, a whole lot more rigorous in their expectations.
Yeah, I think it's still very much early days. I think that level of awareness and understanding is not homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous across countries, across jurisdictions, across actors. I think in the GHG space, actually where I see a fair degree of understanding, not yet full adoption, is around the notion of NDC national level reporting, and this notion of how to be able to use these kind of technologies around what's called nested accounting. So to be able to go from project level emissions to subnational, various administrative levels within a country, and to be able to roll that all up, deal with and avoid the issues around double counting, but also bring efficiency to the process, right? So we're seeing some of that, and I've worked with some countries to be able to start to build the what we call digital MRV frameworks around that. Outside of that, it's really kind of spotty, right? Like, and I didn't speak previously around some actual case examples, which I can just speak to, but very quickly, and these are all in the public domain, so I can talk about them. But we work in the area of what I term differentiated sustainable commodities, right? So in other words, taking traditional commodities like oil and gas, et cetera, and looking at their various attributes and looking at the social and environmental dimensions of them and differentiating to try and extract a value premium that's associated with, say, I'll give the example where we work with digital technology-based company called Context Labs. Some of you may be familiar with, and with Williams, very large upstream oil and gas producer, around what they were calling their responsible natural gas production, which is focused on effectively a sub-product, a sub-commodity around frack-free, okay, natural gas production. So applying at the well pad IoT-enabled sensors and monitors, right, to be able to understand effectively at a molecular level, right, everything that's coming out, everything's going in terms of energy use, water use, et cetera, everything's coming out in terms of being produced, and then being able to digitalize all that and to facilitate turn it into effectively, not a credit, but in this instance, it was more of a certificate, right, that could then be exchanged and become part of a broader portfolio of what the end buyer was terming offsets, where they had kind of the traditional, they had RECs and various carbon credits, but now they had a digital asset as part of their portfolio. That's one example. We're also working with in New Zealand with the Maori around looking at from a natural capital standpoint and looking at their assets from a management standpoint around blue carbon, and being able to use a digital MRV-based framework and infrastructure to be able to put that in place, measure it, quantify it, digitalize it, tokenize it, and then the end result goal is to monetize that, right? But doing it, most interestingly for me, is there's this technology base, but this is coming from the standpoint of traditional Maori values, community orientation, and it all needs to be situated within that. So that's also part of the broader value prop and those differentiated attributes that are associated with the product that's then being transacted.
Great. So let's bring Sam into the conversation. The focus on carbon and the relative ease of standardizing and quantifying data with respect to carbon sort of belies the difficulty in every other area of environmental data. And so it'd be great to hear from the perspective of just impact on and how you're grappling with the challenges of generating data about our natural world and the degradation in the environment that we're seeing, whether it's water, biodiversity, ecosystem values. What are the challenges that you're facing, and what are the tools you're using to address them?
Thank you. It's a really good question, and I'll frame it more around the opportunity, not to be too hackneyed, but picking up on the SEC point and the crazies, I'd say going back 15, 20 years, there were earlier crazies, which were the GRI. And so they already had the Global Reporting Initiative. They already required a lot of, or voluntarily encouraged people to disclose data on far more than carbon. And so we have this fantastic base of data going back many years, like decades, that looks far beyond carbon. And so thanks to the hard work of companies that have disclosed against the GRI standard, on which the CSRD standard is also built, by the way, it's almost exactly the same, there's a base load of data available. And it's patchy, so company by company, they may not have nature data. So I'm talking water consumption, waste generation, air pollution, water and land pollution, biodiversity, these kinds of things. It may be patchy, but in every market, in every sector, you have leaders. So if you look at Iberdrola in Spain, an energy company, they have an almost complete GRI statement. So you've got companies in every sector. Philips, a Dutch medical devices company, brilliant statement. So you use those, and then it gets down through the lines. We crawl and we get data from 15,000 companies globally. And taking sector by sector, country by country, using the data that we do have and check with a team of 50 people, and ML to kind of qualify and check all of that stuff, you then can use machine learning to estimate the data gaps. And so we can create a complete set of data across nature as the kind of base load against which these are the metrics that are CSRD ready. So it is a challenge if you're starting from scratch, but we're not starting from scratch. We have this data. So that's my kind of point one. The next point, which I think came out really nicely on the panel previously, which is what do you do with it all? How do you trust it? How do you apply it? And I think within the CSRD realm, because it's double materiality, and this is a new concept, or certainly impact materiality is a new concept for a lot of companies. But again, this isn't a new concept in the market. So measuring impacts has been around for 15, 20 years. So there's standard ways of doing it, the Value Balancing Alliance, the Capitals Coalition, the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts. They all have very standardized approaches for measuring an impact and conducting materiality assessment. So what we've done is codify that in code, and so that we can measure, if we say, take air pollution, we can look at your SOx, your NOx, your particulate matter emissions in any one location, and tell you, based on the wind speed, wind direction, humidity, temperature, what's happening to those molecules on average, and then how many people are exposed to those molecules, and then how many, and they're inhaling it. And then what does science tell us about if you inhale that proportion of molecules, what does it do to your health? And then in that local market, what's the cost of managing that disease? So respiratory disease, cardiovascular diseases. And we have that, and we measure that, and we put that in monetary terms. And so we can then see quite starkly if you are a company emitting air pollution in Karachi, in Pakistan, versus Boulder, Colorado, there's vastly different costs, negative impacts associated with that. And so we can just take all of that data, push it together, and look at all of these different drivers, what we would call, or in ESRS speak, the subtopics, and compare them. And so it's actually building on a fabric that already exists. You've got the data, you have the method, and CSRD's just pushed them together and said that please do a double materiality assessment and disclose. What I'm seeing in the market is a lot of reliance on qualitative rather than data, which is frankly staggering. If you come from a commercial standpoint, let alone a carbon background, you're programmed to work with numbers. And so it's surprising to me that people don't just take numbers and use them to assess these things. To determine what is, in a coarser way, what's material, and then using your energies to be really precise and also start to act, which is the most important thing. So we're seeing a lot of a reliance on stakeholder, but a shift towards making it data-led. I really like what you said, Catherine, around the kind of people also getting used to the technologies out there. It's not quite bedded down yet. We're going through a digital transformation in the market. But unlike other digital transformations I've seen, I'm very familiar with digital marketing and more commercial type digital transformations. That happened in about over a 15-year period, and we don't have that long, I think, for this. So we're going to hope we can learn the lessons from those previous transformations and really empower companies and stakeholders to, with the right data, the right insights, they can allocate capital effectively to make the change we want to see. So yeah, it's not, in summary, I think it's not as complicated and it's available as people think, because we're building on a lot of history.
Maybe I can just add a comment and full disclosure. We work closely with Sam and Just Impact and think the stuff that they do is great. I'm assuming there's probably a lot of people in the room here which are coming from the carbon side of things in the offset marketplace in terms of product development. You're probably familiar right now, there are these discussions and consultations going on with ICVCM, CQQI around attributes that are associated with these kind of credits and products. And one of the areas is looking at what we called co-benefits from a sustainability standpoint, right? And if you think about what, from an impact standpoint, what Sam is talking about is understanding those dimensions of natural capital, social capital, human capital, and ultimately financial or produce capital, and being able to bring those well-established methodologies that already exist around both the measurement, and I go back to my measurement, quantification, and ultimately valuation, right? Being able to bring those together and being able, from an attribute standpoint, be able to address some of those needs and priorities around how do you actually get to that level of institutional grade confidence in the definition of what those attributes are that are associated with, which may ultimately help to, prime the market, right, around those and demonstrate the enhanced value proposition, and may ultimately, this is all about extracting a value premia that's associated with those products and projects.
Can I just jump in? And I think this is a really important point. This whole, kind of binary, are we about mitigation? Are we about resilience? Are we about adaptation? To the extent that we thought we could just be about, CO2 molecules, I think we're seeing globally that politically, that's not a good way to go. Whether we think, and that in fact we have to care about these other things. So I also want to say that there's a real imperative for us to be able to demonstrate that when we are advancing mitigation strategies, we're actually also dealing with the here and now of communities. And so I think that's a really powerful frame for this, which is, I know in California, there's frontline communities that are experiencing air pollution and other effects, and we need to be able to marry those things up and tell a story. I do think at the end of the day, the data also, another, to me, very important sort of salient point right now is nobody believes in government. They don't believe in experts generally, and they think they need to see it for themselves. That's really, and we can sort of bemoan that reality, but it is where we're at. And actually, we've done a lot of things where we have said we're doing something, but we're not really doing it. So we can't really get upset about that, that people feel that way. So I think that, to me, that's where I'm very passionate about data and about getting better data because, the citizenry is smart and they're going to want to see it for themselves. So I think we can really use that as well to kind of push forward these things politically. I did want to just say your question about regulation and is the regulatory environment going to get us that kind of data? Let's also recognize that, as you know, sort of policymakers, we tend to go for sort of the lowest common denominator. There are realities to we're pushing the envelope with things, and enshrining them into law is a real risk. And so I think that we should not think that GHG protocol is the end all be all. I think it's an absolutely critical driver of the innovations we're going to need in other forms of accounting. So e-liabilities, traceability, all of that. We shouldn't be thinking these are like wars between things. The GHG protocol is absolutely going to be the thing that's going to create a floor for, at least for GHG measurement. And when those companies have to show that their scope 3 emissions dwarf anything else, then when they have to decarbonize the supply chain, they need e-liabilities. When you have to create a market so that you can actually, monetize carbon, you need other forms of accounting. So I also just feel like we should be saying that this is a both and that policymakers will do some things and then markets can drive innovation. And hopefully I see, maybe 10 years from now, we'll be able to enshrine those things into law as we've developed them. So I really think it's sort of an ecosystem.
Can I just build one precise example actually on that? Because I agree, I think the laws and the standards, it's like a composite, layer on layer on layer, and each drives the other. A very practical example is for an energy company that we work with. So you would use the GHG protocol to look at how much carbon is not being emitted because of the work that they do. But they do an awful lot more than just that, and they need to round out their business case to show all the good that they do. So when we work with them, we're measuring carbon reduction and quantifying the benefits of that. We're looking at biodiversity benefits. So biodiversity, by reducing carbon, you have less Amazon dieback, the global warming is reduced. There's a lot of biodiversity benefits. The ecosystem services benefits, the restoration around one of their assets is both adaptation ready, but also has biodiversity benefits, recreational benefits, so we quantify those. Jobs is relevant everywhere, and it's creating long-term jobs that people want. So they're building these in sites that typically don't attract high-paying, high density of high-paying jobs. So creating jobs and valuing that. Society, valuing the social benefits that come with this, putting a value on that. So building that really rock-solid business case. And the critical thing is this isn't like some playful voluntary report that's like, oh, what a nice thing we've done. This is put that on the desk of whoever's paying the bill from the government or your corporate partners, and it's saying, why would we charge you X when we can charge you Y? So there's a very direct commercial benefit to all of this as well. And it won't happen all at once, but I think the rising tide of one company trying to outcompete another and using this as a competitive differentiator is a really positive thing to see, and we're seeing that across sectors.
So maybe this is for both Sam and David, but on that point, do you find that the market is demanding higher quality data, or we need these regulatory drivers in order to motivate them? Maybe start with Sam.
I think we've got enough to start. I'd love to see more. I'd love to see the ESRS FRAG standard explicitly saying that impact valuation is kind of a critical requirement, but the market has been given enough. 1,102 disclosure points, 250 metrics. There may not be a lot of teeth anticipated around what happens if you don't comply, but it's given the market a kick to go in the right direction, and it's an awful lot to work with. And it's, again, coming back to that competitive, the regulator does one thing and the market responds. You start to see the competition around how can we use this not just for compliance, but value creation. And so I'd like to see more, but it's a very, very, very good start. And the same with the SEC as well, of course.
Yeah, well, I would agree from the standpoint of data. I think that,
I said SEC, California.
From a data standpoint, I agree. We've got enough good quality information to be able to work with, right? I think going back to some of my earlier comments, I think what's needed in order to really scale across that whole range of use cases that I talked about is what I consider to be kind of smart, modern, institutional grade digital infrastructure, right? One that marries up the existing kind of legacy IT infrastructures with the Web3, DLT-based ones, and as well brings in kind of those we talked about standards, protocols, rules engines, et cetera, as part of that, and also addresses some of the what I'll call common identifiers or common taxonomies around things like XBRL, right? And you're already seeing this in the CSRD. I think that needs to extend across. So all of those things kind of need to be put in place.
So I guess I'd like to understand it just a little bit better, though. You know, I understand, Sam, that you're comfortable with the impact assessment strategies that exist because they've existed for a long time, and we can build upon them. But you know, if we had the advantage of the sorts of tools that we in the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund are working with partners to build, like the Hedera Guardian, and you had to write those standards today, would you write them the same way, or could we have higher ambition with respect to you know, those impact approaches?
I think what I love about the Hedera HBAR and what we're hoping to achieve together, I think, is we've seen data marketplaces exist for a long time. So you can come and buy GIST data or methodology from various places in the market, but it's not a two-sided market because it takes more to build a use case, which is the codification of the methodology in a trusted way, the onboarding of audit, assurance, consulting partners who are bought into that, which it has to be that combined entity. And I think that's what is a really nice opportunity around Hedera and HBAR that is being built. So it's not so much about data availability and the codification in a better way, it's just putting it all in one place in a trusted way.
Yeah, I would just say, I think there's a tremendous opportunity, and it really wasn't ripe until just about now, to really prove up the use of DLT and sort of and pick some sectors, some value chains, and then really show how that creates more confidence, an ability to monetize either GHGs or other sustainability data. And I think that that's happening right now, and I really appreciate the work of Hedera and the HBAR Foundation to do that. And I think, it was great to see in the last panel, the big four up here talking about when the assurance providers, look at reasonable assurance, and that is not going to be easy to do. I think that being able to say, if a company does, uses and ensures traceability, it's going to create a lot of protection. Not only you're going to meet the disclosure requirements, but that's just really kind of a floor. But you're going to create, confidence in the market. And let's also remember that there is a legal infrastructure, and litigation is just beginning. I stopped doing litigation because I thought there was nothing good you could do with it, and then you realize over time, I'm like, now there's something, Jonathan. It's going to be an exciting time because all of these anti-greenwashing laws, I mean, the gig is going to be up, right, when corporations say things. And so I think being able, you're going to have those outside counsel and counsel inside corporations really feeling a lot better when, the traceability and auditability is just locked down. So I think in the next 3 to 5 years, I think we're going to see a lot of change in the market, and these things that seem very kind of peripheral will start to be that's the gold standard. But I do think we're still in the foothills, and I think we've got to show particular, like I said, sectors, and I think CBAM creates an opportunity with hard to abate. I think if we could just get focused on something and really show it, I think then you'd create a lot more deployment across other areas.
Just one thing to add there, well, maybe two things from kind of reflecting on what I've talked about on this panel today. I really focus on kind of the data and infrastructure components, but I think what's coming out is, the importance, the criticality of the governance and the standards and the smart governance and the smart standards that evolves in concert with these evolving technologies, right? So a lot of effort being done in various parts around that. So, and I agree with your point, Catherine. You know, 1.5, 2 years ago, you know, a lot of this may not have been possible, but it's just that, it's that building block approach, right? So we're just kind of building that critical mass. The other thing is just to give you a sense in terms of, like, you know, there's the promise and potential of the technologies themselves, but you were talking about the reasonable assurance, right? And obviously, from a KPMG standpoint, you know, we're a broad-based professional services firm, and we have that audit and assurance role that we play. And I can tell you, this is not unique to just carbon or other sustainability factors, but this cuts across the board in terms of just pure play financial audit, is how to work within this new digital world, right? Where you're bringing this information on chain. And what does that mean from an audit method standpoint? How do you look at the controls in terms of off-chain data and that's coming on-chain, and dealing with, you talked about the legal and the litigation and the risk components. Like, that is a very big issue that I think just isn't, first of all, isn't going to be solved by any one of the assurance providers. There's an industry coming together that needs to be done around that. But I think it also just, you know, it speaks to, there's a human behavioral cultural dimension to this that we also need to recognize, that there's a, you know, there's just some, I don't know if intransience is the right word, probably shouldn't use that, but there's just, it's a challenge for people that are not, you know, typically, they don't come from a technology-based background, thinking about what this means and what it does in terms of the risk profile. So I think that's just another part of the puzzle that needs to be addressed.
So just to maybe clarify what I think I've heard, and candidly, I'm a little surprised. I mean, a lot of these panels are doom and gloom, and we need things we'll never get, and as a result of not having them, then, you know, the world will burn, et cetera, et cetera. But it sounds as though I'm hearing from Sam that the legal enabling environment is sufficient, right? We have the rules and regs that we need, whether the SEC, the US SEC rule ever sees the light of day or not. We have California, we have CSRD, we have all the other EU Green Deal rules, we have a whole host of other requirements in smaller jurisdictions around the world, and that knitted together, that provides the legal demand driver that we need. And then on the tech enablement side, I hear David, you saying that you know, the tools available to us today are really exciting and can basically lead to the sorts of data quality outcomes that wouldn't ever been possible before. And you know, you're making a fantastic business out of helping companies realize that potential. So I guess what I would like to know is what folks think the risks are, right? If the legal demand drivers are there and the technology is present, we're working really hard to make sure that the technology is present. And if it's the case that, you know, from a kind of market perspective, you know, we have enough of a desire to generate good ESG data that, you know, more legal isn't required, where are the pitfalls? What's next?
If I can jump in just to qualify the statement, I think I'd say ESRS, CSRD goes a hell of a long way. California goes a hell of a long way. I would think we need to see the ISSB take a double materiality approach. At the moment, it's just financial risks in single materiality. So that would be one sort of qualification that we absolutely need on the standards and the regs. What are some of the challenges? Of course, there's many, but one is talent. I think at the moment we're papering over cracks by expecting people to be experts across so many topics, E and S, let alone within E and S, everything that goes. That's incredibly hard to then also translate that into business. So I think we're papering over the cracks with talent that can't possibly do that. And so we need to digitally enable very talented people to take the workload off them from doing the mental maths across all of those things and letting them do their job of knowing a business, knowing what they're trying to achieve and drive a change. So one big gap, I think, is talent, that I hope we can foster.
I would say I used the language before of promise and potential of these technologies, right? And I think, to me, that's the biggest risk, right? Which is not realizing and achieving the power and potential of these technologies. And I think, you know, there are human factors associated with that. There are legal factors, there are financial factors that can all contribute to taking us down a direction that doesn't get us, you know, to the level of speed and scale that we actually require to address these very large societal challenges, right? So to me, that's actually the kind of the flip side of the real potential there. But I do think from a technology standpoint, right, and I talked about some of the use cases and pilots and examples that are proving them out, right? That, you know, there's some really good cases to be made that this can go a long way to serving some of our challenges, but it's the realization of that.
I take the point. You can have, you know, the brand new running shoes on, but you still have to run the marathon, and you know, it's that's not to be underestimated.
Yeah, I would just, you know, it's a great, I love the community we're in. I am excited about what we can do. I do think the reality is, you know, we're missing, it's always going to be about the outside push, right? So we are getting everything lined up. If we do all our jobs correctly, I mean, disclosure is disclosure. And CSRD does get to more of a regulated approach, but the reality is in the United States, we're not going to do that. It's not how things are going to happen. And so we certainly want a carrots approach. We want to create markets. But obviously, you know, I think we also have to have an accountability culture. And we do have to push because you know, we can't make it okay to have, you know, a scope 3 that, you know, is just like ridiculously large and is just saying that it's ridiculously large, just what people are going to start doing. And so I do feel like we are going to have to invest in, I mean, civil society in the end of the day it's going to be critical that we keep pushing. And obviously our job is to be ready to give them confidence in the solutions that we're providing. So that's not all of us in this room, but so that, I think that is the risk, is that, you know, we do everything and then it's sort of like not enough. But I guess that's why we're at the blue zone and the green zone and everything else that we need to do at the same time.
So I'll just add, and maybe we can take a minute for questions at that point. I'll just add, from the perspective of an ex-litigator, and I did promise the panel I would not spend 45 minutes talking about litigation. Litigation isn't only, you know, a positive driver. You know, there's a fight ahead for all of those regulatory mandates that do exist. They will be challenged aggressively, and those battles will have to be fought, because if you know, if all of those legal requirements were to fall, then that has a signaling effect to the market. The market might, all on its own, think these ventures are important, generating data is valuable, but if they're told through the legal system that they're not valuable, then that could have you know, an effect we wouldn't want. But with that, thanks very much to this terrific and esteemed panel. It's a great conversation. Perhaps there are questions from the room in our maybe 1 minute left.
First of all, my name is Svenja Telly, CEO of Denominator, and thank you for this incredible panel. I've heard many panels about this, and the depth was wonderful. My question is, especially for you, David, you talked a lot about attributions and precursors of decarbonized products. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you also pointed towards sort of framing co-benefits from carbon projects more in the ESG and impact space, sort of a crossover. And I wanted to see and ask, if we use a specific product such as, let's say, green hydrogen or green ammonia, and we dive into the digital infrastructure that you explained, how do you think is going to become the product level attributions and the precursors for those sort of products that are at some point scope 3 of a supply chain, but then turn into scope 1? I think that's a very interesting use case to improve digital traceability of supply chain attributions.
Yeah, 100%, and love the question. And quite honestly, I think that's the answer that people are trying to solve for, right? Exactly. So we can have a chat about that after. but I think it's, from an environmental standpoint, I'd say probably more straightforward, right? In terms of, established LCA techniques, et cetera, like that. The social dimensions, right? As well as some of the broader nature-related dimensions, more challenging. And I think that's, there's a push and pull between kind of standardization and codification of the kind of rules around that, or algorithms, or however you want to express it, and being able to reflect the uniqueness of those communities in which those projects take place. And how do you deal with, and I think I had the conversation earlier this morning around things such as traditional knowledge, right? And how that comes to play in the project formation and the ongoing monitoring and evaluation of the project. And how do you capture that within the story, right, of the project? So I don't have the answer for you in terms of how you address it. I think but it's fundamentally critical that it needs to be resolved. I don't know, Sam, if
I would just add, just because it's the finance focus on this COP, I'd say we're starting to see more, so we service large institutional investors like banks, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds. We're starting to see that question come through of like, okay, can you tell us from a sort of cement perspective, can you break that down to what types of cement, and so that you can understand not just carbon, but nature impacts of different types of cement, so that they can compare one company versus another within their portfolio, that would then inform sort of portfolio decisions and stewardship and engagement with those companies. So I think everything you said, but the question's also being asked from shareholders, which is nice.
Yeah. I was just going to, one thing popped into my head on that, and this is, I think another part of the challenge that needs to be addressed is like we talk about this notion of impact, right? Impact is highly contextual, it's highly localized, right? And it needs to be situated in the context of the social, economic, environmental systems in which that activity takes place, right? And so there is this, can you characterize your impact? The impact is in the context of things such as thresholds, allocations, and you immediately get into some of that can be, science, based on science, right? But other dimensions cannot. And there's a very strong, particularly around allocations, there's a very strong ethical and justice dimension to that when you're talking about communities. So how do you bring all that together and factor that in? So, from my standpoint, I kind of think about the issues. I don't have all the solutions, and I think that there are providers, probably such as yourself, that are trying to get at that, or maybe you've already cracked the nut. I don't know. We can talk about that after. Yeah.
I think in the interest of time, we'll have to wrap up. Perhaps I would have liked to give Catherine the last word, but perhaps she'll be available for any questions. And I think we're going to break and come back at 1.